Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrivka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities. From macro to micro, from cellular to societal, and from global to personal. They give you a jar with a grey, gooey, weird-looking substance. And they tell you that it is great. It turns out you need to store the thing in the fridge and feed it on a regular basis. You notice it starts to change and you wonder if that's okay. Is that color normal? Does it smell alright? But what is normal if every single sourdough starter is different? In this episode, we have the pleasure to speak with the curator of the only sourdough library in the world. Surrounded by 128 hungry sourdough starters, Karl de Smedt is the librarian at the Sourdough Library in Saint-Vith, Belgium. Hi Karl, welcome to Ferment Radio.
My name is Karl de Smedt. I am from Belgium, and right now I am sitting in the Sourdough Library because this week is the week where we are feeding the starters. So tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, every sourdough that we have here, and for the moment we have 128, will be fed with their original flour and following the original recipe.
That sounds busy.
Yeah. Well, it's okay. It's only every 2 months that we do that because they can survive for that long time.
Since you said that you sit right now in a sourdough library, I wonder, can you smell the sourdough when you are in the space?
No, you cannot, because they are kept in airtight jars, and then they are stored in the refrigerators. So we keep them at temperatures between 2 and 5 degrees centigrade. And because the jars are airtight, you cannot smell them. And then at such cold temperatures, and I guess people who have sourdough at home have noticed that already, when your sourdough is coming out of the fridge, the flavor is less intense than when it's been bubbling on your kitchen counter for a couple of hours. It's like a good bottle of wine. When you take a bottle of wine from the fridge, you have not as much aroma as when you have it, like they say in French, chambré, or get to room temperature or the desired temperature to unleash all its flavors. So no, there is no aroma of sourdough in the Sourdough Library.
Is there some other way to keep the sourdough starters? Could we, for example, dry them? And if so, why in the Sourdough Library you have selected this particular way of preserving those starters?
Yes, well, that's actually a very good question, and it's a very interesting topic, actually. I do see often on social media people promoting the fact that they dry their sourdough and that they keep it in a jar or that they freeze it. Now, as such, it's not a problem. You can do that. The only thing is that you have no guarantee that the entire microbiological composition or the consortium of microorganisms that you have in your starter before drying or before freezing will be the same as when you bring your dry sourdough back to life or when you thaw your sourdough after freezing. Because during the freezing, we know that microorganisms, they suffer. And if you have a rare species of yeast or a rare species of lactic acid bacteria in your sourdough, well, drying it or freezing it might kill some of these rare microorganisms. That's why here in the library we keep them at 4 degrees, and we have to feed them every 2 months in order to assure that you preserve the biodiversity of the sourdough.
So it's more stressful in a way to freeze them or dry them than keep in these conditions you described.
Yes, freezing is it's very harmful. It's not the best way, especially the freezers we have at home. They stay at what, -18, -20 degrees centigrade in the best case. If we would keep sourdough stored for a longer time, we would have to go to temperatures of -80 degrees or even colder, like they do with other stuff we have here. Of course, every sourdough that we get here is the microorganisms are isolated to be identified, and once we do that, we keep them in small little tubes, and the microorganisms themselves are stored in a freezer that we have here at -80
And
degrees.
coming back to the beginning, so how this all started and where this idea came from?
Puratos, the company I work for, we are of course already existing since 1919, and we supply ingredients to bakeries all over the world. Now, in 1985, we started to look into the feasibility of producing sourdough as an ingredient, as a single ingredient for our customers. And as such, in 1989, we collected the very first sourdough that we have today in the collection, and it was a sourdough from coming from San Francisco. Now, when I started to work in the company in 1994 as a test baker, meaning that I was in charge of testing ingredients in all different kind of bread baking processes, I discovered that sourdough. That was actually the very first sourdough I saw in my life, and today it is number 43 in the sourdough library collection. And then in 2004, we collected a second sample coming from the south of Italy, from a city called Altamura. And we collected that starter because we were trying to develop a sourdough based on uh, a book, a description of a book that we found dating back to 37 BC, where Horatio, he was a Roman poet, describing his travel from Bari, which is in the south of Italy, to Torino, which is in the north. And he said that if you are in Apulia, you better take bread for your onwards journey, because it's probably the best bread you find in the Roman Empire. And we were intrigued by that recipe or by that bread, so we started looking, and we found that still in a town called Altamura in the south of Italy, they still make that bread. And so we bought a sourdough there that we analyzed, and that we used in order to develop one of our commercial sourdough products. And that exercise was so interesting that we decided to do a study on Italian sourdoughs. And so, together with Professor Marco Gobetti, in 2 consecutive years, we selected 17 starters from bakeries and 18 starters from patisseries in Italy, because in Italy, you have a distinction between both, and the patisseries, they make the famous panettone, so the Christmas bread with raisins or with candied orange peel inside, and so on. And we studied them, and we saw that there were more than 400 microorganisms present in these starters. And while we were doing that, we had a colleague from Greece hearing about that, and he said, "But my mother, she has sourdough made from basil leaves." So we collected two of these Greek starters. We had our starter from the US, and so we had a collection in total of 43 sourdoughs. And my boss, actually, who is the business unit director and very into fermentation, was called upon a bakery in Lebanon, where the baker was not using sourdough, but he was using what we call a chickpea fermentation. And that baker had two sons, and these sons had been convinced by someone on an exhibition, a bakery exhibition in Paris, that instant dry yeast is much easier to use than a complex chickpea fermentation. And when they came back to their bakery, they said to their father that they would switch the process of chickpea fermentation, which is a century old process used in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean area to ferment and to make breads, to switch to yeast. And the father was so disappointed that he called upon us. He said, I know you are a reliable company. You exist for more than 100 years. I will give you my recipe and my protocol. And I hope that when my sons realize that what they will do with the instant dry yeast is not the same as what I do with my chickpeas, that they can come back to you and you can supply them with my protocol and my recipe. And I want you to safeguard my recipe for the future. And that's actually what gave us the idea of, we had this collection of 43 sourdoughs and we said, well, probably there is so much more sourdough in the world, and perhaps due to a bakery that closes down because they do not have succession, the son does not want to take it over, or there's nobody. And if they have sourdough, it might get lost. So we, with the library, we try to preserve the world heritage of sourdough.
Mhm. So you've mentioned about this variety of sourdough starters which are in the library. Would you be able to describe what is the difference between sourdough starters? Is it possible to generalize?
There is one thing we can generalize, yes, and that is that they are all very unique. Not one star or not two starters are identical in the library. Although that sometimes the same type of flour is used, they still tend to have a different consortium of microorganisms. We cannot say that by region is this or that. What we do see is that in the literature you find that sourdoughs have a ratio of one yeast up to 50 or 100 lactic acid bacteria. Well, we see that it's not always as such. We have here sourdoughs with way less yeasts and way more yeasts. So these ratios that you find in literature, it's not confirmed. We do get a lot of insights that have not been found before, for the simple reason that never before in history there has been so many sourdoughs compared one to another.
So let's imagine that I am interested to contribute my sourdough starter to the library. How I should proceed with that?
The very first thing you have to do is to go to the website. So we have created this website called www.thequestforsourdough.com, where we ask people who have a sourdough to register their sourdough online. So it's you start by giving the sourdough a name, because we ask you to give a name to your sourdough so that it becomes something personal. And then you have to fill in some of the recipe. You can upload some pictures. You have to give some data, where you are located, where the sourdough is located, how you got the recipe. Maybe you got a piece of sourdough from someone, or you started from scratch, or we try to gather a little bit of information about that sourdough. So, and as such, you are in the network, you are in the picture, and from there we sit together on a regular base with our internal team of experts, and then we look into the sourdoughs that we would like to add into the collection, or sourdoughs that deserve to be in the collection. So that's the first thing you have to do. And what we look at is what kind of flour is used, where is the sourdough coming from, how was it created, how old is there a specific story in it, what kind of ingredients are used. But the most important thing to be accepted in the library is that the sourdough is started from a spontaneous fermentation, meaning that there is no commercial culture that has been used. And we know that Germany, for example, is a country where every bakery has at least one sourdough, but many of these sourdoughs have been produced from starting from a commercial starter culture to have a certain consistency in production. Well, these sourdoughs, they do not contribute to the biodiversity of sourdough. So as such, they are not interesting for the project.
Who has access to the sourdoughs which are in the library? Can anybody get a starter from your library for his own purposes? You know, after all, it's a library.
Let me start by saying that the Sourdough Library is a non-for-profit initiative. So we do not want to, or we do not make profit from it. There is 4 sourdoughs that belong to us out of the collection, but we had them before we started with the initiative. So the starters that are here, they do not belong to us. So it's not, you cannot come here and say, oh, I would like to have a piece of number 78, because it's not our property. They belong property of the owners. What we do is, for scientific studies that are ongoing, we can lend or we can contribute to these studies by supplying the university or the organization that is doing the scientific study. We can provide them some of the sourdoughs so that they can include them into their study.
In normal circumstances, I mean, when yeah, there is no lockdowns and so on, it is possible to visit Sourdough Library, right?
The library is not open to the public. It's not that you can buy a ticket and visit the Sourdough Library. We have the library virtual online. And I know that when people are in the neighborhood and they contact me over Instagram or social media, and if by accident they are here, if they contact me and I have time, it's my pleasure to show them around.
From all the collection, do you have your favorite one?
Anishka, that's always that's like asking who's your favorite child. uh, it's very difficult for me. Of course, I have a special relationship with number 43, for the simple reason that for me it was the very first sourdough I saw in my life back in 1994. I'm a schooled baker confectioner. I went to one of the better bakery schools here in Belgium, but we never learned how to make sourdough. I had to
Wow.
enter in the company to discover my very first sourdough. And I had no idea what it was. Well, I knew sourdough, but I'd never seen one. I never smelled one, or I never made a sourdough bread. But with that one, at the age of 24, so yeah, 26 years ago, I made my very first sourdough bread. And so with that one, it's not my favorite one, but I have a special relationship with that one. And then the others is where when I went to these places to pick up the sourdough myself, I know the people, I know the owners, I know the people behind the sourdoughs. So there I have maybe more affection for one or another, but it's difficult to say like this is my favorite. I cannot.
What about the age span? Are there, like, for example, sourdough starters which are like very, very old in your collection?
Until now, it is impossible to carbon date a sourdough. Okay, if you find a fossil or if you find a stone or anything that can be carbon dated, you can know if it's 100,000 years old or 10,000 or 1 million year old. With sourdough, unfortunately, it's impossible. So I need to trust on what people tell me. So I know for sure that I have sourdough here that is coming from a bakery that exists since 1868, for example, from Switzerland. I have a sourdough from Japan that goes back to 1875, because that's when the bakery was created, and they tell me that they have the sourdough for so many generations. Um, what we do know is that when the sourdough enters in the library, that's for sure. We know that, like number 43, we have in our possession since 1989. So I know for sure that it is a sourdough that has 31 years right
Mhm.
now. But for the others, I have to trust what people tell me. I have 2 sourdoughs from China, and when I went to China to pick them up, one of the ladies said, "Well," I asked, I said, "How old is it?" She said, "Well, I have that sourdough from my grandmother, and she has it from her grandmother. And I don't know if her grandmother had it from her grandmother. So at a certain moment in time, it stops because, yeah, there is no birth certificate when someone is creating a sourdough.
But I also wonder how much the sourdough starter, which continues through the years, also changed within itself. Is it something? I mean, of course, the sourdough starter you have in your library, they are in quite stable environment, but still, are they changing anyhow during those years you've been observing them?
Now, we are well aware that when we get a sourdough from a bakery, that it is a snapshot. It is like a picture of that moment in the bakery. And we try here in the library to keep that picture the same. Now, from the previous tests that we have done, we have not seen big changes within the sourdoughs that we keep here. Uh, what we see, and now comes the example that I was telling you. You have to look at the sourdough like a city. You say that you live in the city of Helsinki. Well, probably 500 years ago, Helsinki already existed, but was a different city with different habitants. There might be still some families or family names remaining from 500 years ago, and probably some of the families that were present 500 years ago will be there in 500 years, but many others will have moved in or might have disappeared. In a sourdough, it's the same. You have families of microorganisms that are present in a mature sourdough, but there is constantly, when you refresh the sourdough, you bring in new families that come with the flour because the flour is the main contributor of biodiversity in your starter. The better or the healthier your starter is, or the more customized to the living microorganisms currently in your starter, the more difficult it is for these new families to overtake the life in the sourdough. But if you neglect your starter, if you do not feed it well, if you change the temperature at which you keep it, you might favorize one or another family to grow more than the other. And the growth of a new family might have as a consequence that another family might disappear.
Actually, when I keep my sourdough starter in the fridge, how often I should feed it?
If you want to preserve the biodiversity, at least every 2 months. And we feed 3 times. So tomorrow morning, we start feeding a first time. 6 hours later, we feed a second time. And then on Wednesday morning, we feed a third time. The 3 times feeding is just to make sure that the population of microorganisms has increased enough to survive for another 2 months. If you go longer than 2 months, you might lose some of the yeasts because they are the most vulnerable. And then, so 2 months is the absolute minimum for, is the Olympic minimum for to maintain the yeasts. Okay, you could go longer, but then you might lose some of the yeasts. I've seen that already. People brag about it. They say, "Oh, look, I neglected my starter for 6 months or 1 year in the fridge, and I fed it, and it's bubbly again." Yes, of course, that's perfectly feasible. But you do not know if it's bubbly because you introduce new yeasts with the flour, or that you have still some of the sourdough that will revive.
I think I did kill some sourdough starters in my life. What I considered it to be dead, or like the way that I don't really want to bake a bread out of it, was that it was getting like a kind of a black layer on top.
Uh huh.
Did I really interpret it well that this was totally useless? Because the smell was kind of still okay. It was just getting this kind of watery, darker layer on top.
But the water is okay, eh? The water is what we call the hooch. And so by if you keep your starter, and certainly a liquid starter, for a long time in the fridge, you will see that the flour is decanting. So it's settling. And what happens is that the hooch, so it's your blend of alcohol and organic acids and water, is coming to the surface. Now, that is a good thing if you want to preserve your sourdough, because once there is a layer of water, you are sure that molds cannot grow on the surface anymore. So your sourdough is locked airtight, actually. So that is a good thing. And then the color, that depends on the pigments that are present in the flour. So I have sourdoughs here where the water is purple, where the water is completely yellowish, and others where it is completely black. But that doesn't matter. So what we do here in the library is we stir it in. So we mix it into the sourdough, and then we scale the sourdough to be refreshed. When I have that at home, my wife and my children, they do not like me making acid breads. They don't like it when the bread is sour. So I remove the hooch. So I just pour it off, and then I compensate with fresh water and fresh flour, and I try always to obtain the consistency of an applesauce, not too runny and not too thick, so that it is easy to mix. But definitely, hooch is something very natural.
So in a way, it is quite useful to have like quite liquidish sourdough starter, because then this hooch probably will happen and therefore it might preserve the sourdough.
I do not like my sourdough too runny. I do not really like to have the hooch on my starter at home, because I prefer to work with a bit a stiffer starter, because the more water you have in your starter, the faster deacidification occurs, because there is much more transport of nutrients for the lactic acid bacteria, that they convert the available sugars faster into organic acids. Where if your starter is stiffer, that transportation of nutrients goes slower, and as such, your acidification goes slower.
Okay, so then how to recognize that my sourdough starter went bad? Is there something which should really make me worry?
When it's not smelling pleasantly. So what can happen with the sourdough is when you open the jar and you did not feed it for a long time, that you have the smell of acetone, like nail polish. That's not something to worry about. That means that your sourdough is very hungry. By just feeding it with flour, you will get it back. When you have off flavors, maybe sulfuric flavors, really unpleasant flavors that have nothing to do with nail polish, then you should get worried, because that might be that you grow molds, or that you grow unwanted stuff inside.
Yeah, the one I threw away also had quite like a cheesy smell.
Cheese is still okay. Cheesy flavors do occur in sourdough fermentations. They are absolutely fine.
You are kind of a, I don't know, curator at the sourdough library, which mission is to keep the sourdough starters for the future. I wonder, do you think the future of sourdough is endangered?
On the contrary, I think the future of sourdough is bright, because sourdough has been endangered already. Yeah? Back in 1854, when Louis Pasteur wrote his memoir on the alcoholic fermentation, he created, or he gave the possibility to start producing commercial yeast on a large scale. And so, as such, sourdough has disappeared in many countries. Many bakeries around the world stopped maintaining that complex, inconsistent process, and they adopted yeast. So, in many cultures, sourdough has been forgotten. And what we see now, luckily, is that bakeries all around the world start to adopt again the use of sourdough. You have to realize that in the past, refrigeration was not existing. I have a book here written by a French pharmacist who was also into baking, called Augustin Parmentier, and he wrote a book, Le Traité Parfait du Boulanger, the treatise in the art of baking. And he describes back from 1778, mentioning that a sourdough should not be sour because people didn't like sour bread, and that he also felt pity for the bakers, because he thought, he said, they are a rare race of artists because they create life out of flour and water, but they are slave from their sourdough, and as such cannot sleep longer than 3.5 hours in a row because they have to feed their starter every 4 hours. Today, we have other solutions.
Yes, there are other solutions too. We can keep our sourdough in the fridge so it doesn't acidify too fast. There is even companies that cultivate sourdough commercially on the big scale, such as Puratos, where today's guest, Karl de Smedt, works. You can find more about the Sourdough Library on www.questforsourdough.com, where you will also find a link to visit it virtually. The Sourdough Library has an amazing collection, and at this moment it mostly represents bread making coming from a European heritage. But there is a universe of sourdoughs out there, and much more to learn and discover. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episodes, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. I'm always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. Ferment Radio is brought to you by Culture of Cultures and is produced by Super Eclectic. Thank you for listening. Keep fermenting and stay tuned for the next episode of Ferment Radio.